Welcome everyone to The Explainer. It's pretty wild to realize that one of the absolute most common myths about evolution is just flat out wrong. If you ask most people how evolution works, they picture an ape slowly standing up and magically transforming into a human, right? They think we evolved directly from the chimpanzees or gorillas that we see at the zoo today. But honestly, that's just not true. The reality is that modern humans and modern apes share an ancient common ancestor. We're talking about a population that lived roughly 7 million years ago. So we didn't evolve from chimps at all. We're actually just really distant evolutionary cousins. And let me tell you, the story of exactly what happened between that ancient population and the humans walking around today is absolutely wild. Which really brings us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? Where did we come from? As we dive into this explainer, we really need to stop thinking about evolution as this perfectly straight line of progress. It's not just a simple, neat march from primitive to perfect. Instead, I want you to look at our evolutionary past as a massive, fascinating genealogical mystery. It is a tangled, complicated family story, packed with characters who walked on two legs, some who had surprisingly small brains, some who figured out how to control fire, and honestly, a whole lot of branches that completely disappeared from the face of the earth. Now, to really grasp this, we have to talk about the sheer scale of time here. 7 million years. Let's just wrap our heads around that for a second. Imagine traveling back in time, and I don't just mean past the ancient Romans or the first pyramids, but millions of years before any of that even existed. 7 million years ago, there were literally no cities. There were no modern humans whatsoever. But somewhere out there in the forests and grasslands of Africa, this unique little group of animals began to walk down a very, very unusual evolutionary path. Let's jump right into section 1 and take a look at our earliest ancestors, the very first hominins. So going all the way back to around 7 million years ago in what is now Chad, we find Sahelanthropus. Then fast forward a bit to around 6 million years ago in Kenya, and a creature called Ouroboros shows up. Moving a bit closer to us, between roughly 5.8 and 4.4 million years ago, we see Ardipithecus. Now, to be clear, these guys were not just miniature humans. They had flat faces, brains that were pretty small compared to ours, and they were living right near that evolutionary split between the ancestors of humans and chimps. But they were starting to show hints of something truly revolutionary. And that revolutionary trait? Bipedalism, walking on two legs. But you might be wondering, how do scientists actually know if a 7-million-year-old fossil walked upright? Well, it's basically a massive detective story. They look for tiny anatomical clues. Take the foramen magnum, for example. That's the scientific name for the hole at the base of the skull where your spinal cord exits. In a dog or a chimpanzee, it's located way toward the back of the skull. But in Sahelanthropus, that opening suggests the head was sitting directly on top of a more upright body. Same thing with Ouroboros. The actual shape of their thigh bones gives us these massive, undeniable clues that they were already experimenting with walking on two legs. But here's the really crucial takeaway. Bipedalism evolved gradually. Take Ardipithecus. This creature had a pelvis that was literally built for upright walking. But if you look at its foot, it still had a grasping big toe. Just think about that for a second. A grasping big toe that is perfectly designed for climbing and moving through trees. They were totally comfortable hanging out in the forest canopy, but completely capable of taking a stroll on the ground. Our ancestors didn't just suddenly drop out of the trees one Tuesday and start sprinting. Different traits evolved at totally different times. And this brings us to a huge paradigm shift. We have got to abandon what we call the straight staircase myth. That's the old idea that each species was just a neat little stepping stone progressing directly toward us. The actual reality is much more like a messy branching tree. These early hominins were diverse evolutionary experiments. They were just different populations trying to survive in their own specific environments. And exactly like any experiment, a lot of those branches just didn't make it and eventually went extinct. All right, moving into section 2, we're going to see how walking actually came long before thinking with Australopithecus. So, skipping forward to between 4 and 2 million years ago, we meet Australopithecus. You have almost certainly heard of the incredibly famous fossil named Lucy. Lucy was an Australopithecus afarensis, and her skeleton proved something completely mind-blowing. She was highly adapted to walking upright on two legs, but her brain was still super small. very ape-like in size. For the longest time, early scientists just assumed that our massive brains evolved first, and then we stood up. But Lucy and her relatives proved the exact opposite. Walking upright came millions of years before we grew those massive, highly intelligent brains. We were walking a long time before we were, pondering our own existence. And to really hammer home the point that evolution is this messy, branching tree, we find incredibly weird, unique species like Paranthropus. These guys lived around 2.7 to 1.2 million years ago. Imagine a hominin built pretty much entirely to be a heavy-duty food processor. They had these enormous chewing muscles, massive jaws, and huge teeth that were perfectly adapted for grinding up super tough, fibrous roots and plants. But here is the kicker. Paranthropus is not our direct ancestor. Talk about an evolutionary side quest. It was a highly specialized side branch. It survived really successfully for a long time, but when their environment changed, that extreme specialization actually became a trap, and they went extinct. It just proves evolution doesn't have a predetermined destination.
Okay, on to section 3. Enter the Homo genus, where things start looking recognizably human.
Let's trace how our very own genus builds up over time. Around 2.4 million years ago, we get Homo habilis, which, amazingly enough, translates to handyman because they're associated with some of the absolute earliest stone tools. Plus, their brains were getting slightly larger. Then, right around 2 million years ago, we see this massive evolutionary leap. Homo erectus appears. Fast forward to 700,000 years ago, and we find Homo heidelbergensis. Notice the big shift happening here. We are definitely moving away from the small-brained, upright apes of the past. Suddenly, bodies are getting taller, legs are getting significantly longer, and brains are getting substantially larger. I have to say, Homo erectus is truly the breakout star of this era. They survived for well over 1 million years, which is just an unbelievable run. But most importantly, Homo erectus did something completely unprecedented. They walked out of Africa. They spread all the way into Eurasia, long before modern humans ever even existed. Their bodies were beautifully adapted for efficient long-distance walking and even running across wide-open landscapes. Plus, they were manufacturing increasingly sophisticated stone tools. They were the ultimate survivors. Now, let's fast forward again to about 700,000 years ago to Homo heidelbergensis. These were powerful hunters with big, complex brains. But what is really fascinating about this specific group is where they sit on the family tree. They were at a profound crossroads. It's right from this broader group of populations that human evolution begins to split down vastly different paths. One of those branches would eventually lead toward the Neanderthals, while another branch entirely would lead toward us, modern humans. Which perfectly sets up section 4, cousins and coexistence. Because for a long time, we were definitely not alone on Earth. So let's talk about the Neanderthals. They lived across Europe and Western Asia. And for decades, pop culture has painted them as these stupid, grunting cavemen. I'm here to tell you that outdated picture is completely wrong. Neanderthals really just need a better PR agent. They made incredibly sophisticated tools, organized complex hunts to take down massive animals, and confidently controlled fire. Even more amazingly, we have actual fossil evidence showing they cared for their sick and injured. They even created pigments and wore ornaments. These were complex, compassionate beings with brains that were comparable in size to our very own. And get this, they weren't our only cousins. Scientists recently discovered the Denisovans. What's so incredible about this is that we didn't find beautifully complete skeletons of Denisovans. Nope, we basically just found tiny, fragmented pieces of bone and teeth sitting in a cave. But thanks to the magic of modern technology, geneticists were able to extract DNA from those tiny little fragments and realize it belonged to an entirely separate population of humans. They lived at the exact same time as Neanderthals and early modern humans, literally sharing the planet with us. And this right here is where the story gets deeply personal. The Denisovans and the Neanderthals didn't just vanish into thin air one day. Because multiple human species were roaming the Earth at the exact same time, they interacted. If you look at the genomes of people living today, particularly those with ancestry outside of Africa, you will find a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. And in certain populations, like in Oceania, you'll find a notable percentage of Denisovan DNA. We actually interbred with them, so their biological legacy didn't die out. It is literally walking around today, alive inside of you. Bringing us to our final act in Section 5, the rise of Homo sapiens, and how we became the sole survivors. Our emergence, which started roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa, wasn't just some sudden magical moment. It was a massive snowball effect. First, walking efficiently on 2 legs freed up our hands. That allowed our increasingly large brains to experiment with making complex tools. Making those tools demanded better social cooperation, which demanded better language, and all of that led to the ultimate game changer, rapid cultural evolution. You see, we stopped relying just on biological evolution. We started passing down knowledge, how to build a better fire, how to craft a sharper tool, how to survive in totally new climates. Culture evolves infinitely faster than biology ever could, and it's what made us incredibly adaptable. But as we expanded out of Africa in this great migration all across the globe, what actually happened to the others? Why are we the only ones left standing? Well, there was no single catastrophic extinction event. Instead, it was a really complex web of factors. Dramatic climate changes severely disrupted the specific habitats our cousins relied on. As Homo sapiens moved into those areas, there was suddenly increased competition for the exact same limited resources. And, as we just discussed, there was interbreeding. That means some of these populations were simply genetically absorbed into our own, much, much larger population. So, what should you actually take away from all of this? Well, take a quick second and just look at your own hands. Think about your upright spine, the specific way your teeth are shaped, the immense, unparalleled computing power inside your brain. Your body literally carries the physical clues of an enormous 7 million-year journey. Every single trait you possess was forged in the fire of survival, built by species that walked before us and species that lived right beside us. You are quite literally a living museum of adaptation. I absolutely love this quote from the source material because it perfectly summarizes the core theme of our explainer today. The human family tree isn't a ladder leading toward us. It's a vast, complicated tree, and we are simply the branch that survived. We are not the pinnacle of some predetermined linear plan. We are the lucky inheritors of millions of years of messy, brilliant, and incredibly resilient evolutionary experiments. Which leaves us with one final mind-bending thought to close out. If our past is really this dynamic, and we've now entered an era where we can physically alter our environment, where we can cure diseases, and literally edit our own genes, where will the next branch of human evolution lead? Are we even still evolving? I'll leave you to ponder that one. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into our past. Stay curious, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.